You may get a little excited when you shop at Burlington.
What a low price! You see that? They have my favorite brand! It's like a whole new Burlington! I can buy two!
I'm saving so much!
Burlington saves you up to 60% off other retailers' prices every day. Will it be the low prices or the great brands? Burlington. Deals? Brands? Wow! I told you so. Styles and selections vary by store.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
The spring storm season has been deadly and dangerous. Severe storms and tornadoes.
Over the last week, the central United States has been walloped.
108 million people are in the bullseye for tornadoes, damaging winds, and giant hail. CBS's Nicole Valdez is in London, Kentucky.
It started out with thunderstorms, then tornadoes.
Good morning, Katie. I can see a lot of damage right there behind you.
More than 24 people are dead in Kentucky and Missouri following tornadoes on Friday that uprooted trees, leveled buildings, and flipped cars. Despite the
In some sections, the tornado hacked a path that was half a mile wide on the eastern side of the forest.
Pictures tried to convey the scale of what happened. But honestly, when storms travel hundreds of miles from St. Louis, Missouri to London, Kentucky, it's hard to fit all that destruction in a single frame.
So this is where you hid.
This is where we was at, right here.
His home of 47 years, now scattered across his lawn.
What happens now seems obvious, right? The aid rolls in. It is, or starting to. But the question is how much the feds are going to kick in. In fact, at this very moment, there are people on the ground trying to assess whether these storms were destructive enough.
There has to be a survey, an on-the-ground survey, where FEMA officials and state officials and local officials look at the damage and they try to put a number on it. In other words, what's the cost to repair this, and to see, does the number meet a threshold that FEMA sets?
Does it have to be a certain kind of expensive to get the federal funds?
Traditionally, the answer has been yes, but it's not exactly clear what the Trump administration is doing.
Tom Frank reports on disaster relief over at E&E News. He says in the last few months, there's been this change. The federal government has started flouting its own guidelines for sending aid.
There have been several disasters this year in which the damage that occurred during a disaster has hit a state threshold, but the president did not approve disaster aid.
It sounds like you're a little bit on the edge of your seat right now, trying to figure out what happens next.
The whole world is, the whole country is on the edge of their seat because nothing has been announced.
You know, in all the reporting about the tornadoes from this weekend, something that struck me was that a large cluster of storms, like what happened in Kentucky and Missouri, it's the kind of weather event that seems to be getting more common, probably because of climate change. So if I'm like a governor of a state like Kentucky or Missouri, what does that mean for me?
What does this mean for states? I think between not just the increasing number, but the increasing intensity of disasters, meaning the increasing rainfall, which in a state like Kentucky creates flash flooding in valley areas, and that destroys property and kills people, that states need to be doing much more on their own. And what that really amounts to is allocating more money.
To be clear, this means allocating a lot more money. In the past, a state could lean on Washington for something like 3/4 of the cost of things like cleaning up debris or repairing public facilities. But now,
there is enormous uncertainty, and it's building because hurricane season starts in 11 days. And one thing that emergency managers at the state level, local level want is certainty. They want to know, if we get hit, will FEMA be there or not? And that's not known.
It sounds like there are two things happening at once. The disasters are getting worse or more expensive, and the federal government's support is getting less reliable.
And there's a third thing, and that is that growth and development, no pun intended, but it's sort of a perfect storm of three things colliding at the same time.
Today on the show, is the Trump administration's disaster management system becoming a disaster itself? I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today? Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. And that's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you can save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states and situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Last year, when Hurricane Helene hit the Southeast, you did some reporting that basically warned about how a second Trump administration could handle disaster response differently. Why did you want to write that article in October 2024?
It's an issue that was getting no attention. There was no focus in any of the presidential debates or press conferences or rallies or so forth about climate change, about disasters. And if you read, say, Project 2025, there were some major plans in there to change the way the federal government responded to disasters.
What were the plans?
Well, exactly what you see happening now. Basically, the plan is to shift the burden of, let's call them moderate and minor disasters, to states. FEMA would still respond to the Hurricane Helenes, the Los Angeles wildfires, but lesser storms or events would be really up to the states to do all the logistics as well as pay the funds for the repairs.
Yeah, Ken Cuccinelli was the author of the section that included FEMA and really spoke pretty openly about shrinking FEMA. And in fact, you quote him as saying, people think of FEMA as a first responder. It's not a first responder, which just kind of struck me because, yeah, I do think of FEMA as a first responder, but I thought that was the whole point. It's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It manages emergencies.
So there are key words, a key phrase in the federal law that governs FEMA, and that phrase is beyond the capacity. So FEMA under federal law responds when an event is beyond the capacity of a state to respond. And the idea that FEMA has been responding to too many disasters, too many small disasters, has been around for a long time, going back at least to the Obama administration. And there is a consensus in the emergency management community that, yes, FEMA is overextended and that it really isn't necessary for FEMA to, say, give Vermont $1 million to clean up after a snowstorm, because states should be able to afford these small disasters. The question then is, where do you draw the line? In other words, how high do you raise the threshold for FEMA involvement? And the numbers that have been out there about what the Trump administration are looking at would be a very significant increase. What's not clear is, first of all, are the numbers that are out there actually what FEMA will implement? And secondly, what will the time frame be? So the concept of what the Trump administration is doing is actually quite reasonable. The question really is the transition. I don't think states are anywhere near prepared to take over what FEMA used to do.
Part of what was interesting about your reporting, looking at Project 2025 and what it might mean for disaster response, is it becomes clear reading it, disaster response isn't just FEMA. Like FEMA works in concert with other administrations like the National Weather Service. And you can see that in what happened in Kentucky with the tornadoes. There were reports that in Kentucky they needed to borrow weather service personnel from elsewhere because this storm was coming and they didn't have the people. And Project 2025 had laid out cutting all of it, including the National Weather Service, right?
Yes. Nobody should be surprised at all by anything that's been happening. It's all laid out in, a 900-page document that's online for anyone to read. That said, I will say that FEMA plays a unique role. They've got this phrase, something like locally managed and federally supported, which is to say FEMA doesn't run the disaster recovery, it funds it. So FEMA is to some extent a check writing agency.
Sounds like the Republicans' least favorite thing, a check writing agency.
I mean, in theory, yes. But it's free money is another way to look at it. So the bipartisan support for FEMA is really striking. Some of the strongest supporters of FEMA are senators from Louisiana, which is probably the most reliant state on FEMA, and senators from Florida and Texas and a lot of Republican states, because FEMA has given them billions of dollars over the years.
So explain to me a little bit how the Trump administration has managed FEMA since it came into power in January. Like initially, Donald Trump appointed a guy named Cameron Hamilton to run the agency, right? He's gone already. But what was he doing?
That's a good question. I don't think Cameron Hamilton or his replacement, David Richardson, truly has a lot of control over FEMA.
Why do you say that?
Because it's really being run out of the Department of Homeland Security, which is the department to which FEMA belongs.
So when Cameron Hamilton came in, my understanding is that he kind of talked a big game about not needing so much aid. But then the disaster started to hit. How did this all go down?
I think Cameron Hamilton started to drink the Kool-Aid, if you will. I think that he came in, and if you look at his social media posts before he took office, he was very, very critical of FEMA. And then he spent 3 months or so working in FEMA headquarters, surrounded by career staff who have been doing their jobs for years, visiting disaster sites, talking to victims, talking to local officials, and talking to members of Congress in Washington. And all of those people believe very deeply in what FEMA does. And that's really what people think brought Cameron Hamilton down, is that he said at a hearing a couple of weeks ago, a House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing, that something like the American public is not served by eliminating FEMA.
And then he was booted out.
It's not 100% clear, but that is the White House press secretary, Carolyn Leavitt, said basically it was his testimony that got him fired.
So enter David Richardson, a former Marine Corps officer who also doesn't have a lot of experience managing emergencies, I don't think, but he's running FEMA now?
Yeah, he has no experience managing emergencies, and he is in charge of FEMA. But as I said, it doesn't really matter because he's not making any of the decisions anyway.
So since he's been in charge, which is just a couple weeks, the Wall Street Journal had some reporting from a meeting where Richardson apparently admitted he's not ready for hurricane season, which is not what you want your head of FEMA saying.
Well, yes and no. No, in an ideal world, you don't want them saying that, but you also don't want them lying. And the fact that he said something like that, you can look at it as a helpful statement to put out there, better than saying, oh, sure, we're ready when you're not ready. Kudos for his candor.
You know, I'm wondering if maybe it makes sense to walk through a disaster aid decision that got some attention over the last couple of months, just to understand how all this bureaucratic chaos can actually trickle down to states.
The most, glaring example is in Arkansas, where the governor, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who of course was President Trump's White House press secretary in his first term, was denied by President Trump.
Arkansas is currently dealing with the aftermath of storms that took 3 lives, injured dozens, and caused billions in damage in March. But the administration has turned down multiple requests to declare a major disaster, saying the damage wasn't severe enough to require federal assistance.
So here's the way the process works. So this is not a catastrophic disaster. The dollar number was something like $8 million or $9 million worth of damage. And that was enough damage to meet the threshold for Arkansas.
So the feds are supposed to step in.
FEMA will make a recommendation to the White House and finally gets to the president's desk. And in this case, what was unusual is that the president rejected the request.
This is notable to me because the governor of Arkansas, she's not like some blue state type.
Right. Well, when you think about it, what a wonderful way to send a message to the country that you're serious about this and that you're not going to play politics, and that just because she was his press secretary, she's going to, the same new difficult rules are going to apply to her. So, did President Trump make a test case out of Governor Sanders? Maybe. The denial got an enormous amount of attention, much more than I've ever seen any denial get.
FEMA eventually approved some aid for individual Arkansas residents, but the broader public assistance funding, that is still being withheld. After the break, is this approach the new model going into hurricane season? We'll be right back.
The spirit of innovation is deeply ingrained in America, and Google is helping Americans innovate in ways both big and small. The Air Force Research Laboratory is partnering with Google Cloud using AI to accelerate defense research for air, space, and cyberspace forces. This is a new era of American innovation. Find out more at g.co/American innovation.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Not everyone is careful with your personal information, which might explain why there's a victim of identity theft every 5 seconds in the U.S. Fortunately, there's LifeLock. LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats to your identity. If your identity is stolen, a U.S.-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year by visiting lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Factor. Optimize your nutrition this year with Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal service. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved, ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from 40 weekly options across 8 dietary preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Eat smarter at factormeals.com/listen50 and use code listen50 for 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Factormeals.com/listen50, code listen50. T's and C's apply.
Part of why I wanted to talk to you is that you have this interesting take on FEMA, which is that maybe the states have become too reliant on federal assistance for small-scale natural disasters. It seems to be something that folks actually agree on.
It is true. It's so FEMA is basically an insurance policy for states with no premium. And because there's no premium, there's no incentive, or I should say a minimal incentive for states to do the things that they could do to reduce damage from future disasters by, whatever it is, elevating homes in flood zones and things like that.
Yeah, you wrote about how one of the proposals in Project 2025, it had actually been proposed by someone in the Obama administration. It was basically a way to, give a little something to states to reduce future damage. You have stronger building codes, things like that.
Well, it's a way to basically get rid of what some people call a moral hazard, that if you know that FEMA is going to be there and pay 75% of the cost of everything, then that's easier than investing states' own money in building resilience against disasters. And yes, this is a idea that has been around for a very long time. And personally, as someone who has covered FEMA, I think it's right on spot.
But at the same time, one of the first cuts the Trump administration seemed to make at FEMA was getting rid of these grant programs that gave money to people not to rebuild after a disaster, but protect themselves into the future from disaster, right?
And that is an absolutely fair point. The program you're talking about gives out $1 billion or so a year to states and communities to build this resilience against disasters. And ironically, the program was launched through a law that President Trump himself signed in 2018.
Is it worth talking about one of the programs and what the cutting of the funding means?
It is, because it's so the name of the program, it has an acronym called BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. And one of the things about what Trump did to BRIC, which is he basically canceled it. So there's no more money coming out, and about $3.5 billion worth of BRIC money that had been promised to states and communities for various projects was pulled away. So in some states, you have projects that are literally half finished, but the federal money has been removed. And there has been enormous pushback on, again, both sides of the aisle against what the president did. But the reality is that what he did actually was perfectly legal, because the way the law is written, presidents, Trump or anyone, have enormous free hand on what they do with disasters. So if President Trump or any president decides, I'm not going to approve another disaster declaration as long as I'm in office, they can do that.
Wow. I hadn't even thought about that.
Well, and I think that there's been a lot of things that people don't understand about FEMA. And like you said, you thought of it as a first responder agency. It may have taken that role, but it shouldn't be, because if there's a wildfire in some remote part of Oregon, it's the locals are the ones who can get there first. And I think that the big question here is whether FEMA has induced bad habits by taking care of everything and saying, "That's all right, we'll do it. We'll pay for it. And states say, well, fine. We like that."
I guess I don't know what this all adds up to for Americans over the next few years, because it sounds like there are real changes that needed to be made within FEMA. But I'm not sure if this is the way to make them, because if I'm a governor right now, I have no idea what to expect from this agency.
It's all really in what happens, how the Trump administration handles any withdrawal, in effect, of FEMA. If the administration says we're going to do this over, 4 years, so each year the threshold for getting FEMA aid is going to go up, but just a little bit, and so that after 4 years, and this is just a random number, it's going to be at the goal we outlined.
So weaning the states off of aid.
Exactly. And also being aware that states are in vastly different places in terms of their capability. So states like Florida and Texas they're the varsity. They have a lot of experience dealing with disasters. So they have very strong disaster agencies within the state. They have lots of funding for it. But a state like, say, Kentucky or West Virginia, which really hasn't been thought of, neither has been thought of as a disaster-prone state, but they keep getting hit with these flash floods. Those are the kind of states that they have a lot of gaps they need to fill before they can take the kind of role that I think President Trump wants them to take.
Well, and this seems like one of the problems with what's happening right now, because we know with climate change, these states that haven't been used to disasters are going to experience them. Like, I don't think it was on anyone's bingo card, all the flooding that happened in North Carolina. That was incredibly devastating. And so to take the funding away now suddenly leaves a state like that really vulnerable.
Yes, absolutely. But this is the world we live in these days, where you have these hurricanes that, they hit the panhandle of Florida and then they just go straight north. The winds weaken, but the rain doesn't. And when you get to Western North Carolina, which is, hills and valleys, and you have a lot of development in these valleys, the streams overflow and they just, destroy anything that gets in their way. So this is a totally unexpected kind of disaster, a hurricane in the Appalachian Mountains.
Hurricane season is about to begin. And I think of that as, I don't know, FEMA's Super Bowl. Like it's the moment when FEMA, I see them more than anything else, I think. What are you looking for over the next few months as an indicator of what's really going on at the Federal Emergency Management Agency?
I am watching like a hawk every request every governor submits for FEMA aid, for the president to declare a disaster.
What will that tell you?
You look for patterns and try to, intuit a policy out of the behavior and the decisions. And then you also look to see if they actually do announce a policy. But there's clearly a new policy in place, whether it's been announced or not. And, another thing to watch, and this is off subject, is what happens at congregate shelters. In other words, will immigration enforcement take place at congregate shelters?
You mean disaster shelters?
Right. The high school gym that becomes a shelter with 200 beds in it or something, where anyone can go and just stay because their house got demolished or something.
I hadn't even thought about that possibility, but of course, with FEMA operating under the Department of Homeland Security, I guess it makes a kind of sense.
It does. And if you want to have me on for another interview, I can talk about this. But DHS put out a new policy, which isn't the right word, but I'll just leave it at that, requiring grant recipients to follow immigration enforcement. A lawsuit was just filed by 20 Democratic attorney generals trying to overturn that policy. And it's a concern largely because people are worried that if they know there's going to be immigration enforcement at a congregate shelter, that a lot of people just won't go, even if they're in the country legally, because maybe their cousin is here illegally or something, or they have a roommate. And that's the last thing you want to happen during a disaster, is for people to not evacuate when they're told to, and to stay in their home, because that's where casualties occur and deaths.
That's grim. Tom Frank, I'm really grateful for your time and your reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Tom Frank oversees E&E News' climate finance team. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Madeline Ducharme, Ethan Oberman, and Isabel Angell. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you back here next time.